to discuss what is Linux and why should you learn it. Topics will include what is Linux, and to describe that, we're going to get into some details like what is a Linux distribution, Debian-based, Red Hat-based, and other distributions, software package management differences between the different distributions, and also briefly touch on Linux user interfaces. After we do that, we'll talk about why you should learn it, which distribution should you pick, and installation options. So what is Linux? Basically, it's a family of freely available Unix-like computer operating systems. The Linux kernel and most of the user space supporting programs are published under various open source licenses. These include the GNU or GNU General Purpose License, the MIT license, the Apache license, and some others, which are beyond the scope of an introductory video. It was originally created for use on desktop PCs running on Intel x86 CPUs, but now runs on many architectures ranging from ARM to, again, it's still running the x86, to Apple M1 or Apple Silicon, and all the way up to IBM mainframes. The creator was a computer science student at the University of Helsinki named Linus Torvalds. And he originally developed Linux as a student because he couldn't get a hold of or couldn't afford another Unix-like operating system called Minix. And that was back around 1991 or so, early 90s. Comes in many flavors, which are referred to as distributions or distros for short. So you can pick and choose between the ones you like, or you may need to learn one or the other depending upon what your employer might be using. So what is a distribution? This is an important concept to get. There is no one thing that's just the Linux operating system. A distro or distribution is the Linux operating system kernel plus supporting system software and libraries. Most of these supporting packages come from the GNU or GNU or GNU project. Hence, sometimes you'll see it referred to as GNU Linux. Because this is all open source software, anybody is free to create their own distribution and make it available to the world or just to hang on to it. Most distros are based on one of two primary versions. There's Debian Linux, and the other one is Red Hat Linux. However, beyond those, there are hundreds of Linux distros, at least hundreds. The number one place to explore them online and see what the different distributions are is distrowatch.com. On this slide, we can see some of the Debian-based distributions. The most well-known and the most popular are Ubuntu and its variants called Kubuntu, Lubuntu, and Xubuntu. There's another one called Knoppix, and that one's known for being a live distribution, meaning that you can run it right off of a CD or DVD, although you can also install it to your computer's disk drive. Kali Linux is also derived from Debian, and what Kali was developed for is primarily for information security in the form of penetration testing. So to the unknown, that might be just called a hacker distribution, but it's a very useful tool for cybersecurity professionals. Raspbian is another Debian-based distribution, and this one is primarily used on Raspberry Pi single-board computers, which are small, inexpensive, low-power devices. They are general-purpose computers, so you can browse the web on them, send and receive email, or you can use them as sort of embedded applications to create a little appliance, for example, a router or a DNS server or a DHCP server. That's just scratching the surface of the Debian-based distributions. The other main family is those distributions based on Red Hat. And I've heard Red Hat described as sort of the 500-pound gorilla of Linux in the enterprise space. It has been used for a couple of decades now. It's very popular in large corporations. So there are a lot of different distributions like Alma Linux, excuse me, uh, Amazon's AMI, which is used in Amazon Web Services, the Fedora Linux project, CentOS, Oracle Linux, Rocky Linux, and Scientific Linux, which is actually produced at the United States government's Fermilab. So if you learn one of these, it translates very well over to the others. There are also a few other distributions, actually many other distributions. SUSE or SUSE Enterprise Linux and its fully open source, fully free version with community support is called OpenSUSE. And then we do need to mention Slackware. Slackware is the oldest distribution that is still maintained. It was first released in 1993, which as of the time of this video is 30 years ago. So for those of us who have been using Linux for a long time, it may hold a special place in our hearts because it may have been the first or one of the first distributions that we ever used. So related to all that is software package management. If you've used a Mac or if you've used a Windows PC, you probably know how to install or remove software. So on a Windows PC, for example, if you download a piece of software, it'll come as an executable with a .exe extension on it, or it may be a Microsoft Windows installer file with a .msi. Things run differently in Linux, and depending upon the distribution you're using, you'll need to use a different set of tools to install software, to apply patches, or to remove it. So the Debian family and the Red Hat family use different tools. And then the final thing, and this is less common now than it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago, is the distribution of software is just raw source code along with things called makefiles. And you would actually have to have a software compiler on your computer in order to compile the software and install it. So that's not nearly as convenient nowadays as using the Debian or Red Hat package management tools. The package management tools also help you avoid things like what's colloquially described as dependency hell. So it is something, though, that you may encounter as you use Linux systems. So let's take a look at the Debian-based distributions and how they handle package management. So software precompiled binaries intended for use on Debian typically is distributed in files with a .deb or deb extension. You do installation, removal, and patching with tools called dpackage or dpkg and apt, apt. And here we have an example of how to install and how to remove a software package called nmap, which will no doubt be the source or the subject of a future video. So you'll notice also there's a command there called sudo or sudo, and that's an abbreviation for something called superuserdo. So if you've ever installed or ran a piece of software on a Windows system and you need to run it as the administrator, run with administrative privileges, sudo or sudo is how you do that on a Linux system. So typically to install a piece of software, patch it, or remove it, you need to have administrator privileges on the system, and the way you get that is through sudo. Red Hat distribution is a bit different just because it uses different tools. And also the installation files tend to be in a different format. So they tend to have RPM as the extension. And RPM stands for Red Hat Package Manager. And you use tools called RPM, YUM, or DNF for installing installing, patching, or removing software. So for example, you could do sudo yum install nmap or sudo yum remove nmap, and it would download the nmap installation RPMs from your distribution source, and it would install any software dependencies that the program needs and handle all that for you. DNF is a more recent tool. It was developed to replace YUM, and on some modern Red Hat derived systems, if you type in YUM, it actually redirects you to DNF. So let's talk a little bit about Linux user interfaces. And I'm coming at this from the vantage point of somebody who is using this in a large enterprise. Not talking about somebody who is using this on a desktop or a laptop instead of Windows, which is a viable use case. But most people who are looking to learn Linux are looking to learn it so that they can use it at work and use it to administer servers or other devices. So for administrative use, I strongly, strongly recommend that you learn how to use the command line. And here on the right, I have a screenshot of a login session on a Raspberry Pi computer. And this is running what's called the bash shell, which stands for Born Again Shell, which is not real important right now, but it is what it is. And this is accessed over something else, a different kind of shell, which is a network shell, which is called SSH, or secure shell. And if you are interacting with a Linux server, this is how you would be doing it most of the time. Normally, these things run as headless boxes, which means if it's in a data center or a server room, there's normally no keyboard, there's no mouse, there's no monitor attached to it. So you have to access it over the network. That being said, there are many different graphical desktops that you can use on Linux systems. Some of them are named here: GNOME, KDE, LXDE, XFCE, and a whole bunch more. So, for example, one place where you might see XFCE is on a Kali Linux laptop that a penetration tester is using to assess the cybersecurity status of a network. So they are out there. When it comes to administering Linux servers, graphical tools can become a crutch and can get you into trouble in the sense that if you get used to them and then you need to use a system that doesn't have those particular tools installed, you can run into a bind because all of a sudden something that you knew how to do, you no longer know how to do. You'll have to learn it. Whereas if you learn this from the command line, you can work on pretty much any system. And for a Linux system administrator, that's extremely important. Okay, so now that we've discussed what Linux is, some package management, and some talk about the user interface, why should you bother? Why should you learn Linux? You're probably watching this on either a mobile device, like a cell phone or a tablet. You might be watching it on a laptop or a PC, and it could be running Mac OS, or it could be running any one of whatever flavor of Microsoft Windows. So why Linux? Well, it's ubiquitous. Linux is extremely widely used in modern information systems. It's in your house, it's in small businesses, and it's in large enterprises. Learning Linux opens doors for well-paying jobs. I started learning Linux in the late 90s, and it's enabled me to remain with my current employer for a very long time. It's provided me with a good living, and it's honestly, most of the time, it's been pretty fun. So it's a good way to get a job and support yourself and your family. It also gives you a chance to build proficiency on the command line, as I discussed in the previous slide, and that's needed for server and network device administration. So even if your primary job doesn't involve administering network devices like routers or switches, typically those are configured and maintained using the command line interface, either over secure shell or through a console server. And if you get comfortable on one command line, even if you go onto a different system that has a different interface, just being comfortable on one command line makes it a lot easier for you to adapt to other command lines. And then finally, it can be used to help protect your privacy because your computers or your phone's operating system isn't spying on you. Um, we've all probably heard many different news stories about spyware, malicious software, um, or even things like Microsoft Windows sending telemetry back to Microsoft, or Apple monitoring certain things. This is not an issue when you're running Linux. You can potentially get malicious software on it if you're not careful, but when you get it out of the box, so to speak, when you just install a fresh distribution, it's not set up to spy on you. So, touched on this previously. Where is Linux used? And once again, it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It is used on some desktops and laptops. It's extremely commonly used on servers, whether they're physical servers sitting in a data center somewhere, virtual machines running on things like Microsoft Hyper-V, or more commonly VMware ESXi, and especially up in the cloud and with various providers like Amazon, Google Cloud Platform, even Microsoft Azure. I believe you can get Linux VMs. Other cloud-based providers also provide Linux VMs, and or you can get actual Linux servers hosted in a data center by a provider. Also, a lot of embedded devices that you run into in your home or in your business or out and about are running Linux under the hood. So cable modems that are out nowadays, a lot of them run an embedded version of Linux. Smart TVs. I'm pretty sure that Samsung smart TVs use a base operating system that's Linux derived. Surveillance cameras. You'll see a lot of these surveillance cameras that have a web user interface on them. You can get them for your house or you can get them for a business. They typically run on a very stripped down version of Linux. And it's my understanding that some of the control systems in Tesla automobiles are based on Linux. In addition to that, mobile devices that are running Android are all running on a variant of Linux. Graphene OS is a privacy-focused version of Linux for use on cell phones. And then, in addition to all that, various network devices. So there are some routers, switches, load balancers, firewalls, intrusion detection or prevention systems that are running on Linux. So knowing Linux will help you work with all of these different kinds of systems. So we've talked about all these servers and systems, but like what sort of services are available out there that are actually running on Linux? So web servers, probably the two most popular are Apache, and then the other one is Nginx, Nginx. Most domain name servers are running on Linux. Domain name system essentially is the phone book for the internet, and what it does is it translates human-friendly host names like www.google.com or www.youtube.com to the numerical address that a computer uses to reach another computer. So that's very important. Um, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, or DHCP servers, often run on Linux. They're also often in local networks. They'll also run on Windows servers, but a lot of DHCP servers are actually Linux. Another one that most people don't think about if they're not working in IT is Network Time Protocol, or NTP. And what this is used for is to synchronize time between all sorts of different things that are on the network, like servers, routers, switches, cell phones, tablets, laptops. Virtually everything is dependent in one way or another on time, and NTP servers are the way that time is generally distributed to most hosts on a network. The NTP servers themselves actually normally get their time source from GPS, which is considered the most accurate. And then other NTP servers will consult what's called a Stratum 1 server. And this will be the topic of another video. File servers running network file system, or SMB CIFS, which stands for Server Message Block, or Common Internet File System. So NFS is used for providing file services over a network to usually hosts running Unix or Linux type operating systems. Samba, or the server message block, is the file sharing protocol used in Microsoft Windows networks. And it's also used for sharing out printers on a local area network. There are various network attached storage devices, little appliances that you can buy for your small business or even large enterprises, and they run Linux underneath. And then a lot of database servers are running on top of a Linux distribution, whether it's MySQL, PostgreSQL, and even, believe it or not, Microsoft SQL Server. These things typically run on Linux system, where in the past they might have run on a commercial Unix system like something running Sun Solaris. Most of that nowadays has been migrated over to Linux systems. So how do you get Linux? It's actually really easy to get if you have a broadband connection that's reliable. You can download it directly from the distribution websites, and then you can take that ISO or ISO file, use it to either burn a disk or write it out to a USB stick, and then boot a computer from that. You can do that. There are certain distributions that are called live distributions, and what those allow you to do is actually run Linux without touching the hard drive of your computer. Or then, if you decide you like it, you can choose to actually install it to a hard drive. However, I do want to recognize that not everybody has a reliable high-speed internet connection, or they may be bandwidth limited, for example, if you're on some sort of a satellite connection. So it is possible to buy Linux installation disks and USB sticks from various places. Amazon.com carries them. There's a vendor that specializes in this called Linux Disk Online, and they're available at pretty low cost. It'll be a few dollars, and so that they will actually just ship you a disk or a USB stick, and you can then do your installation directly from there. So what distribution, or which distribution should you pick? Most distributions actually have more similarities than differences. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter. That being said, as I mentioned earlier, Red Hat Enterprise Linux is kind of the 500-pound gorilla in corporate use, at least here in the United States. However, Red Hat does come with some restrictions on its use when it comes to getting support. So rather than trying to download Red Hat, and unless you're able to get some sort of a corporate account or something like that, it's a good idea to use something like a derivative. Now, the one that I used to always recommend for that was CentOS. However, they changed some things with CentOS that I was not really a fan of, which are kind of beyond the scope of this video. But that did prompt the creation of a couple of more freely available distributions with very good community support. So two of those are Alma Linux and Rocky Linux, which is the one that I've been using. Either one should be fine. If you want to use Ubuntu, that's become increasingly popular in enterprises as well. So it's not a bad idea to get that and actually learn how to use that. It's actually, if you can, if you have the disk drive space, if you have the time, if you have the bandwidth, it's not a bad idea to download and install and try out one flavor or another. And then the reason for that is that way you get familiar with the package management. And there are some differences in how the file systems are arranged, which we'll cover in future videos. And so once again, if you plan to become a Linux administrator, learn how to do the administration on the command line using command line tools. Don't get stuck on graphical tools. They can be very handy. They can be quick and dirty, but they're not on every system. And this is where there's a bit more of a difference between distribution flavors. So you might, for example, have a tool on Ubuntu that's not available on Rocky and vice versa. So rather than getting stuck on one or the other, learn how to run a text editor on the command line and actually do your configuration there. And also where that will help you out is if you're accessing something over a network and it's a high latency or a low bandwidth connection, it's much easier to do that on the command line than it is on a graphical tool. Because with a graphical tool, there's a lot more data that needs to go over that connection. So what are your installation options? So the first way to do it, if you only have one computer, whether it's a laptop or a Mac, is you can install it as what's called a dual boot system, where when you turn the computer on, you're presented with a bootloader window that asks you if you want to go into Windows or if you want to go into Linux, or if you want to go into Mac OS or you want to go into Linux. Note that this option is only available on Macs if they're one of the older Macs that's running an Intel processor. That's something they call Boot Camp. But since Apple changed over to the new Apple Silicon, which are the M1 or M2 Macs, Boot Camp is no longer available. Better option, if you can do it, is running virtual machines on your local computer. And depending upon which operating system the host is running, it will determine which options you have available to you. So Windows hosts can use programs called VMware Workstation or Oracle VirtualBox. Either one is fine. Workstation is available as both a commercially supported product, which costs money, or there is a free home use version. VirtualBox is free. It's open source software. In my experience, VirtualBoxes work good enough for my needs. If you have an Intel Mac, you can run VMware Fusion, which is essentially the Mac version of VMware Workstation, or there's a version of VirtualBox for the Intel-based Macs. Now, if you have one of the newer Macs, like one of the M2 or M1 MacBooks, you can't run software, or you can't run operating systems intended for use on Intel processors, and your virtualization choices are a bit limited. So there is a program out there called UTM, which I have running on a MacBook Air that has an M1 processor, and I have an ARM version of Kali Linux running on it, and it seems to work pretty good. It's not quite as stable as VirtualBox or Fusion was on my previous Intel Mac, but it's definitely usable. Another option, and this is considerably more advanced, is if you have an extra PC with an Intel or an Intel compatible processor like an AMD, is VMware offers a free version of their flagship product, which is called VMware ESXi. That's used for running virtual machines in enterprises, in big clusters where they're supporting hundreds or thousands of VMs at a time. If you can find a relatively low-cost PC, but you can build it up with enough disk space and RAM, this is actually a pretty good version, and in my home lab, this is what I'm doing. But I'm also a VMware administrator at work, so this helps me there as well. But this, like learning Linux, is a good skill to pick up as well. Maybe not at first. Next option would be to get yourself a Raspberry Pi, which it's a small single board computer. The computer itself, the motherboard, is about the size of a credit card. They were designed to be made and sold cheaply so that they could be used in educational institutions. And a lot of hobbyists have adopted these as well. They're pretty nifty little machines that don't use much electricity. They are inexpensive, and so what some hobbyists will do is they'll come up with a small single use for one of these, and sort of a DIY smart home type thing. And so they're a good way to learn Linux as well. And then finally, Linux, especially if you're running primarily command line, they can run well on older PCs and Intel Macs. So if you're using, or if you have one of these laying around, you've been meaning to get rid of it, you can reconsider that. As long as the thing still runs, you can download Linux, the installer, and overwrite the hard drive, get rid of Windows, which will also help secure your privacy, because you'll be getting rid of all personal information on there. And you don't need a whole lot of disk space, you don't need a whole lot of RAM, and you don't need a whole lot of CPU power. You could have a 10-year-old computer and run Linux on it just fine, especially if it's just something that you're learning with. So, in conclusion, what is Linux? It's a freely available Unix-like operating system, runs on a huge variety of hardware. It supports many critical services in big enterprises and small and in home use. Everything ranging from cell phones and tablets to network devices to servers, and even some webcams that are out there. It's available in a very large number of flavors, also known as distributions or distros. The two biggest families are based on Debian Linux and Red Hat Linux. They're the two major branches. There are some differences, but overall they're mostly the same. And final reason for learning it really is the proficiency in it is in high demand in the workplace. If you are getting into IT, or you've been in IT and you want to improve your employability, if you learn it, it's going to open up some really good earning opportunities for you, and it can help with job security. So with that, I'd like to thank you for watching. If you liked it, if you found it informative, please hit the like button and subscribe. Don't forget to hit that notification button so that you get notified anytime I post a new video. If you think this was valuable, please share it either to social media or to friends. And then just one final disclaimer is, since there were some pictures in here, anything that is a distribution name or a logo, that remains the property of their respective owners. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you soon.